Today we're going down first and then up.
Well, I guess we can start with what comes to your mind when you think about like
Pleasure?
pleasure and inspiration.
You're saying a connection between those two, or each of them
Just a
separately, or
few
whatever?
words, like what?
I mean, I think in many ways pleasure is much more easier to talk about than inspiration, because I think inspiration in some ways is something I maybe struggle with. So I'll set that aside. You'll have to be like, the interview took place along a babbling brook. Yeah, I mean, I think pleasure is something that I think a lot about and seek out a lot. I think it's something that, yeah, I think joy and fun and pleasure are things that I'm very aware when I'm not having them in my life. I mean, the thing I always say is I'm a mature 5-year-old, and while there's a lot of maybe negatives and challenges to that, I think the reason that resonates with me is because of this idea of like joy and fun and pleasure, this kind of like attitude. And then I think, yeah, so when I think of the word pleasure, I think it's this idea of really allowing yourself to, I don't know, embrace life, I guess, ultimately, um, which I think the world can really make difficult to do of all that's required of us, especially as adults. And so, something around the childlike ability to just embrace and move towards joy and pleasure. And yeah, I mean, if a child is not having fun, they're gonna move on. They're gonna like say, oh, nope, on to the next thing, or have a tantrum or whatever. As adults, we maybe might do that, but it looks very differently. And also, I think we're conditioned to not change course. And so, yeah, I think I struggle with this question of like, we have to, I can't survive without eating. I can't survive without eating, or if I'm too cold, or all these other things. And they're not just given to me in the same way a child receives them from caring adults. So there are my life maybe can't be focused 100% on pleasure, but when pleasure is really reduced to an afterthought, I think that's really hard for me.
So what would you say your pleasure like lineage is like? Who taught you how to have fun or like feel pleasure? Like over the course of your life.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually probably something that just like comes from a very youthful place. Like I think, growing up, my mom was around. She wasn't working until I was maybe 10 or 12, I think. So I think just like having that space to be and to be nurtured and just kind of again allowed that space to experience joy and pleasure. And then I think I just kind of like held on to it. I think as an adult and as
Is
a
there an
young adult.
example, like an image come to your mind as a child? Like what? Oh, that was like pleasurable, like when you were talking about growing up.
hmm I'm gonna think while we get around these people. I mean, in some ways, this is less an example around me and more about kind of, and I guess it's in many ways it's an example of generosity, but also I think pleasure and just like, I guess generosity is connected, like it's a way to provide pleasure into the world.
Mm.
But my mom, stay at school, and maybe other times she would like bake cookies and then go into our town area, and then like as people were walking home from school, just like hand out cookies to people. So I don't know. I mean, that's, I guess, an image to me that's kind of about this like seeking joy and creating an abundance of joy for and with others.
What kind of cookies were they?
Just chocolate chip. These are like she just made like her. She kind of has these like famous chocolate chip cookies that she. But yeah, I mean, I think just anything kind of just like sitting and playing a game or just like playing make believe. Yeah, I think those are just those kind of things. Yeah, I think just again creating the spaces to. Yeah, I don't know if I have any more examples or anything around that. I guess the other thing, I mean, I think about joy also in terms of like, because I think often like it's it doesn't require. It doesn't require money. Like you can just find joy in doing things and laughing and embracing the moment. I think if you're just allow yourself that space. So I think that's another thing where it's kind of just like, yeah, like you don't need much. You can just talk and play, and there can just be joy in everyday life. And I think that's something that I really try to, yeah, embrace. Like, not everything has to be like serious, or not everything has to be like pressure filled.
Like, is there a moment or something where you realize this? Like everything that you're talking about, right? Like, oh, I want joy to be this way, or like, um, are there like moments over time, or was there like it was inspired by one, incident or several to for you to sort of define joy or feeling pleasure in these ways?
I wish I was that kind of person, but I don't think I have. And around some things like that, I don't think I have this like, oh, this is when I finally it dawned on me, or
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a eureka moment, but I mean, I believe that it is sort of like an amalgamation of different things. And then we sort of, you know, it's like in that Inside Out movie, how like so many things and it becomes like a core memory, right? Like they visualize that. So something like that, where,
I think it's ultimately through like reflecting on like having relationships and then reflecting on them and like what felt good. Just kind of
mm,
this like process of continually reflecting on like what felt good, what didn't feel good, what felt safe, what didn't feel safe.
mm,
I think it's just this like ability to not ability to, but it's just this like experience of that again and again. And I think that's yeah, I think I've been reflecting on that aspect of like, I need, again, like I said, not every moment of life is just going to be joy and pleasure, but I certainly need a balance, and I recognize if that's lacking.
mm.
So, did you want to take a picture or take a break?
No, no, I was just gonna say, because I was thinking like when we first met, two things. Like one was where this thing about how you would send letters was or use the paper again. And so that to me was like, oh, like just taking something that I would have otherwise like thrown away or given up for recycle, this piece of paper, right? Then you can just flip it and like write letters and then it becomes like this thing that can commemorate like a memory or like become like a piece of something that gives you pleasure or joy. And the other thing where I always remember, um, like one of the first interactions we had where I don't know if we were like, okay, let's date or like decided to date, but then this intentionality that you brought in where you were like, I remember it very clearly because it was something that I would say or I would want to see with other people if I was dating where, okay, there's no games like you text, you call, like that is that. If you cannot like pick up my call and then you call again, or there's no games basically, like because that is something that happens a lot where you're trying to measure how much the other person is being intentional. So it would always be this game in my mind with other people. But when you said it, I was just like, oh shit, like that is what I always have things, but then I have never voiced it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you voicing that was such a like relief. And then everything else was as if like infused with pleasure because then there was no game, right?
Mm.
That can happen when you first start dating or like all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, like those two things like really stand out. And so where did you learn that? Um or like where was that coming from
Yeah,
when
yeah.
we met? Like
Yeah, I
back in
think,
2009, I guess, right?
yeah. I think they come from two different places. Like I do think there's some overlap there. I think in terms of the like the letter writing aspect and kind of the other just like repurposing or like yeah, as you were describing that, I think what was coming to mind for me was just this idea of like I don't know if making the most of it is quite the right phrase, but again, this idea of like how can you kind of create something even more. So like it's I mean with letter writing, I always it's like well you know you can get stamps in the US that just have the flag on it, right? But you can also just pay the same amount of money and get stamps that have like a fun picture or an idea. So like why, again, especially when there's like no difference other than like asking the person when you're buying it, like why not have that? Like add that in. So same thing, like, okay, I can have this piece of paper with lines on it and write a letter, but it's just like that's what it is. But why not for, again, the same amount of or even less money because you're taking paper that you might have thrown away. Why not have that added in? Or like if you have stickers or if you have crayons or like, again, why not? I think there's maybe just this kind of like, well, why not? Like opportunity, again, why not sprinkle this in the experience and then it becomes like a nice little added touch and it's like special. And then obviously it created this memory in you where it's like, oh, this is a kind of a fun thing. So I think it's just this kind of like, why not mentality? I think, I mean, by the time we met, I had done a lot of letter writing when I worked at camp and other things. So I think that like developed of like, oh,
Yeah.
well, like, why not? I have this paper. Like, oh, or maybe, maybe started as like, oh, shoot, I need paper to write a letter. Oh, here's this bill from the doctor's office, or here's this, note from something or a menu. Why not use this? Like and then it just became, oh, now let me add a poem in here, or let me add something from an article I read and
Like comics from
comics or something. Yeah, like, oh, this is something to kind of like, why not? Like nobody's telling me I can't, and it seems like a fun thing to do. So I think that's for that piece. I think the second piece about the like creating intentionality, or I don't know what the word. Yeah, I think kind of getting rid of
parody.
getting
Yeah.
rid of artifice, I think ultimately is like what, like there's so much time and energy, especially in relationships, spent on this like questioning or unsurety or whatever. Yeah, and I mean it can bring up a lot of anxiety or just questioning. And so yeah, I think to your point, like getting rid of that allows space for the other things to happen and the other emotions or the other experiences. And so I think, I think in many ways it's about kind of me finding a groundedness.
Mm.
But then I think, as you said, that groundedness can bring pleasure and the opportunity for pleasure when you feel safe and comfortable.
You also said, like, I remember you were like, I don't celebrate Valentine's Day. And like, there were two things. Like, one, the other thing I remember is like the Valentine's Day, like, it's a capitalist stuff. Like, we can gift you, I can give you things. Like, those are not out of the question, but like, we're not going to celebrate that. And then the other one was like, oh, yeah, yeah. The other one that I think I took it to also sort of like I do have a pet, I do have a cat, but then you were just like having pets or cats, like it's just or like having a pet at home because you are sort of like owning the animal and you're like very against that idea. And I think that like having a four-legged being around me, I think I always think like, okay, is this becoming too much where you're buying stuff for the animal, like doing all this stuff, like where it can go too overboard. And so in my mind it was almost like, oh, what would Eric do in this situation? So I think like really good values in my life where like don't like both things, like where like don't buy, like have money be involved in interactions, but also like saving, or like this is for a lot of us who will like hold on to like little pieces of paper or like something that reminds you of someone, then you can like write it in a letter, like all of that. I think I was always like a sentimental person that way, but I think it emboldens like your sentimentality when someone else in your life where other values align also do it. Then it's like, oh, I'm like so much of who we are, like for myself, I'm is a reflection of like what other people tell myself about like me, right? And so I think getting that, like being vouched for in that way, where they're like, you're like, yeah, I like to do this too, where we're just so we were raised in such different places with like different sets of values. Like you have your own way of looking at religion and your belief in God, and I have my own way, but then also finding common ground where it wouldn't make me feel comfortable engaging with someone who is like religious in the way that you are, because of my own like upbringing and having to go to like a Jesuit school and like the way Christianity has like forcefully like entered my life, where I didn't like feel like I had choices, right? So in all of that, like finding someone who has their own way of like looking at God, like all of those things were like, oh, okay, I never thought I could find commonality in it, but then there is sort of that commonality of like putting value to objects and things in a way that is not like materialistic,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, what you said, it just feels like I gave you permission to do this thing that was already there. And I think that's,
Yeah.
I think, yeah, that can be how joy and pleasure work too. Like there's this idea of permission, getting permission from someone else. Because I mean, I think there was a way, like I said, I was trying to give myself permission, but that can be really hard to do, to give someone
Mm,
permission. And I think I still struggle with that, like to give myself permission to want what I want and have that be okay. And
mm.
so then finding another person that can kind of give you permission, or the two of you can give each other permission. Yeah, I think that's a good yeah, that's
I
a
think
good
the other
challenge.
thing that I really remember clearly was that, like, I've been someone who's always felt like, okay, I want to make my own space, my own understanding around like sensual and sexual pleasure. But then I think the big thing that I had yet not like thoroughly thought about in my mid 20s, like before I met you, was that there was still this sort of romantic idealized idea that, oh, if someone loves you, they will know what pleasure, how to pleasure you, or like what you are about. Which is like part, there's having intention versus knowing are like different things, and sometimes it feels like we think, or we also put that pressure on ourselves that we can mind read the other person. But then there was like, I remember being like, you would say, well, let's sit and like talk about what feels pleasurable to you, and we will like, and I'll tell you. And then at first I had this reaction of like, wait, but doesn't that take away sort of the romantic aspect of it, talking about it? Because most of the images or media that I was used to was like things just happening, like, oh, people can just almost like read their mind, and that's what like finding your soulmate or like that consists of. And then being like, oh, that's totally wrong. Like, yeah, you can tell by someone's how someone appears, or like sometimes not even that, right? Like how they're feeling internally. Like, how would you know if you didn't even talk about it? So then taking that conversation, quote unquote, like outside the bedroom or whatever, was like I think something that I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to like do it. Because usually if you want to talk about sensual sexual stuff, it's like, oh, this person is like too much, or like oversexed, or like wants, why do they want to talk about this? This is like a private matter, right? Even within the two people, like it has to
Mhm.
happen in the confines of the bedroom. Like you don't just like sit during breakfast and assess, like bring it, like, or you do that if something is not going well.
Mhm.
So like finding, like, is that something that you were doing with confidence, or were you like just trying it out?
I don't remember too much of that, but I think, as I think about myself at that time of life, I think it was again from this like in some ways the opposite of the confidence, like, oh, I don't have confidence, so how can I find that if not through learning or talking, right? I mean, I know, like, certainly, like, I remember like reading books, and too, like buying a book and be like, oh, I don't have confidence in this area, so I need to like somehow get that. And so I think, again, even back to just the point of like declaring, like, oh, let's not play games or let's not do whatever. I think there's a sense of like, okay, well, to have a conversation, to talk about this with someone is a way that I can feel confident, secure, guided, maybe even. So yeah, I think for me, there was this sense of like, if not this, then how? If not through conversation, if not for engagement, if not for discovery in a more direct way. Yeah, I think there's many things now that I feel very hesitant to engage in direct conversations about. But I think if I was, at that point in my life, there was a lot of things still to be discovered for myself and around pleasure, and other, engaging others around pleasure. So I think it's just like, okay, well, and I think again, there was this idea of like, if not, if I don't do this, well, what the heck is going to happen? Like, how will this even happen in a joyful, pleasurable way, if not through these conversations or more direct ways of doing it? Um, and yeah, I think there was a point where, yeah, I think there was even this kind of like, just, yeah, the general idea of, yeah, if this isn't something, or I think there wasn't enough experience of like, oh, this, like you saying, kind of this like, oh, we can't do it, like this is wrong, a wrong way to do. I think that I just didn't kind of have, and I think generally don't have this like, oh, you can't do it this way mentality. I think there's, yeah, coming, happy in many times, or again when I feel safe and comfortable enough to break the mold or the expectations, if it feels like that is gonna what that will be what brings forward the um yeah, maybe back again to the joy, the pleasure. It'll That's what is needed to have this kind of more direct way. When I'm feeling safe and comfortable and it feels kind of able to engage.
Is this getting you to think about any other things,
Any other examples or any other?
like about things in your life, like
Well, I mean, it certainly is contrast now with some of the ways in which I might feel hesitant to be as direct. I think, yeah, these kind of like, it makes me wonder back, like, wow, why was I feeling so, I don't know if confident is the right word, but, confident to like, oh, I don't want to play games, or oh, let's talk about these things. Like, I think in some ways yeah, I don't know. It comes out in different ways. I think that's why I was emphasizing the safety aspect, because I think if I'm not feeling, I don't know, triggered, or if I'm feeling, yeah, safe and grounded, I feel more ready and able to be more direct and be more off the beaten path or whatever. But if I'm feeling more anxious or unsure or lacking, not necessarily a physical safety, but an emotional kind of comfort and safety, then I think I'm much more like, okay, well, I can't get into this, or I have to do it by the book, or things like that. So I think it's that, like, it's just this recognition of what's happened in the years since then and the ways that maybe has showed up at times, but also plenty of times where it hasn't shown up in that same way.
yeah, because as you're talking, like, we like to use the word loitering a lot, like just sort of being in that realm and like looking like, oh, what's gonna happen here? Like really taking time to explore without like a very set agenda of how things should look like. I think, yeah, that is been really key for me also, because otherwise it's almost like in the beginning it felt like, you're breaking all these like, okay, assumptions and barriers of like, okay, you can only have intimacy after marriage, like these things, and they break down. And even if you have like a lot of space to explore, then realizing like, oh, I'm still conditioned to like, oh, okay, the orgasm thing, right? Like there's still like other sort of these scripts that still need to be followed, like if you watch any shows like Sex and the City, which had a lot of influence, right? And so there also, when I have rewatched or seen reels, like so many, they're like at the cusp of like doing something really like very subversive, but then still the script kind of pulls back and is very heterosexual, right? And then your imagination then gets sort of like tied down and you build those boxes, like then another set of conditioning kind of comes in. And to spend enough time in those spaces, like if you have people or private spaces like where you can talk with your friends, where then that lending to being like, oh, it's like this for you, or actually it's like this for me, where it's coming from people who look like you, who are, have similar life experiences, versus like something in media telling us like this is how it, should be. Yeah. Yeah, like those that like it's I think there's so much like to always like discover, which can be fun, but then we're also told like at some point you'll just know everything, so you don't have to like it'll be like very easy. But I think almost there's no such thing as that, and the process of it is something that needs to feel pleasurable so that you're inspired to like go back to explore more, you know. So I think a lot of us, like, at one point, like, oh, is this it? Like, okay, this is what it entails. And then that can feel very restrictive. Like, if being told that, you have to orgasm with penetrative sex never made sense to many of us, like, doesn't make sense to me. And then you meet other people who are like, yeah, this never, not what they show on TV, even in the best shows, like, no, that's not how it happens, right? Like, that's not what it looks like. I think just to hear someone else say that felt very liberating, and was like, oh, I'm on to something. Like, okay, when I was like suspicious about, like, this is not feeling okay, then I was on to something. And I think that kind of builds on your own self-confidence, and that, oh, I know my body and I know myself.
Mm-hmm. I think I need a break. You're like, too bad.
Thank you.
You're signed up for
Forever.
10 hours.
All right, now we're recording. All of us have been working on mental health, our own personal mental health, and as a therapist. So my question was like, in terms of, let's say, relational, sensual, sexual pleasure, what are some of the things that, I guess, right now that you are sort of like witnessing, figuring out with people who come to therapy, to you, and then how has it sort of transported in your own thinking about pleasure in your own life? How has it influenced you?
Yeah, I mean, you can't help be influenced by talking to people, even if that's in a professional setting as a therapist yourself. Yeah, I think in many ways, around the ideas of pleasure, it's not every client. So I'm thinking about some of the clients where it does come up or has come up. But I think in one way, it's just kind of either reinforced or helped me kind of get more clarity around the like, I think I don't know if multifaceted is quite the right word, but this idea that there's more than just like an action that is involved in pleasure. That, okay, whatever, you can have this action and it can cause you to feel physical pleasure, but that's also a very limited understanding of pleasure, I think. So
Like
thinking about
transactional kind of almost, or
transactional, but also, yeah, I think there's like, and maybe this is, I'm already assuming kind of a relational pleasure, like, or pleasure within relational frameworks, because I think, I mean, yeah, I think we were talking, this came up yesterday in a conversation, this idea of, I think for me, like sexual, physical pleasure alone is a very different experience and feels very limited compared to that with someone else. And so I think it's just maybe reiterated some of that for me in terms of like, yeah, where and how my own um like what do I get out of it beyond, like what do I get out of an experience of pleasure, or especially physical pleasure beyond that, like maybe nervous system kind of pleasure or something, like what is there about the connection and the, yeah, that the energetic exchange that is involved in the pleasure experience. And I think for me, yeah, I think that's something that, both inside this realm, but also stepping outside the realm in terms of just, I think, how we were thinking about relationships earlier, like this idea of pleasure in relationship is something that's very, yeah, I think it's very central to me and how I think about pleasure. Like yeah, I can do things alone, again, whether it's sensual or intellectual or whatever. These things can bring me pleasure, but I think there's an enhancement of that for me when there's a relational aspect involved.
I think like as you were talking, from my own experience and where my sort of thoughts were coming in was that for a lot of the times, like let's say like sensual, like relational pleasure with a partner, or you find someone where you're starting that journey, a lot of the times what I would see happening is that like there's intention and you have like a really amazing time, and it almost feels like it was like not coincidental but serendipitous, and then after that you want more of that, right? And then that doesn't like necessarily like happen. And so that got me to thinking like, okay, where how to start like conversation about being intentional, because you want, your nervous system, when it enjoys something, it wants more of that, and so it wants that person, you want that person around you, you want that experience. But then sometimes it's like, oh, it felt really like a rush, and then it felt good, and then it's like, oh, I thought it was just like it was magical, and then now what do I do? And I think in therapy, for myself and for people who've when I've done the work, sort of that continuity, like the language of like how do we language like that continuity of what can feel good. Um, that is not a struggle, but just like it takes some kind of like thinking through, which seems obvious, but then still it's kind of difficult, right? Like to sort of ask, like, oh, this is what feels good in the most simplistic manner, because sometimes it can be misconstrued as like the other person thinking that they don't know how to pleasure you. So then, like, what has for you felt useful?
I mean, what was coming up as you were talking to me is, I think, a question that I think about a lot in all of my work, specifically as a therapist and working with people, but then also I think in my own life and my own relationships, is like just this idea of like what gets in the way. And
Mm,
I think that sometimes what can get in the way is the nervousness of asking for it, or like the fear that the conversation will, like, as you said, like, if you talk about this outside, then it'll ruin the spontaneity, it'll ruin something, or the, expectations, or maybe there's some anxiety or fear or trauma, or it's just like, whatever, I am going through a really stressful time at work, or um, just lost somebody close to me, or whatever. Like, these things also impact, I think, our ability to access pleasure. And so I think, to your point, like sometimes it can feel like, oh, that was so great, and then like what happened here? Like, why was this today not the same? Why didn't we repeat
mm,
this? And I think, yeah, being able to think about and even assess and reflect on, like, was there something that got in the way? And it may be just
mm,
like, oh, before I wasn't thinking about, it was just like this fun, light experience, but now I'm thinking about this relationship in a more emotionally deep way, or a more like pressure filled way, or something. Or it feels pressure after the last time went so well. So I think for me, there's often this like, what is getting in the way? And I mean, there's,
that was the alarm.
is this still recording?
I think so. Check.
It looks like maybe. Well, that's just, I was looking, that's a reflection of the.
Yeah, it's still there.
Yeah, I think there's also this book by I think it's Emily Nagoski is the author's name, Come As You Are, where it really talks about context. And I think it's
Mm,
important to recognize like what are the different
yeah,
contexts. And part of that is what gets in the way, but also like what helps you feel good and open and safe and all these
yeah.
other things. And so I think that's, yeah, there's, and then again, the ebb and flow of life and time
Mm.
and all these other things can very much, yeah, just get in the way and be a struggle.
Yeah, like when you're uh saying those things, like you said, like for you it sort of involves other people actively, like the act of pleasure. And it's interesting, like navigating places where knowing what place I can, there's more chances of sort of creating those situations that involves like another person. And then there are times when that is not possible. I think for me, one of the things has been like the ritual for like self pleasure, where, you know, that is such a key element for like getting to know my own body. Especially having so many sort of these deep rooted ideas that I'm told that someone else has to sort of ignite that fire, quote unquote, you know, that someone else will come along and sort of tell you what pleasure can feel like. And that gift is always there. But then also like the idea around like self exploration. Um, After I started having like my own personal space, right? Like because for the longest time you don't have personal space. Like you're sharing spaces, you're in college, like I'm assuming you'll have a roommate, you know, at the beginning of years and all of those. So that gets in the way. But then when you have once like you have your own personal space, um, I got really into the idea of like, okay, like what can I make possible for myself, you know? Be it like being sort of disappointed or sort of not having those chances or like something getting in the way, right? And so as much as you are good at expressing it, you know, when you're in those moments, it's difficult to like tell someone like what it is that you like. I think something that it took me a long time to like get over is that okay, using like a self pleasure thing, even if when there's another person involved, you know, because different people can take it in a different way. And later on, as I gained more confidence, I was like, okay, depending on how will that person react, right? Like if they feel like, oh, is this mean like I'm not pleasuring you? So then there's always like a space for communication and to also get their anxiety to lessen, like no, no, this is like kind of augments the experience, you know. And then if someone is really dismissive, then it's also something, you know, that okay, this person and your like way of pleasure like don't align, right? So then all of these things come in with like experience. But I think a lot of the times, and I think mostly because so much of, for me also, I was told like another person will tell you like what pleasure will feel
Mm.
like in your body. And then the self pleasure aspect comes with so much taboo, like, oh, how much are you thinking about these things, you know? So then you like kind of self police yourself. But that has also been a huge part where like even when I cannot access pleasure with someone else, I can say like, oh, I these are the ways in which so having and then having personal space and using it for that, like at least even if I'm not dating or if I'm like, oh, there's no one, you know, I go on dates and don't find anyone, so kind of still feeling inspired to like, oh, not like just meet anyone and you know that that person might have quote unquote a lot of red flags and you just are feeling desperate, but then saying like, hey, no, like I think I'll get myself off like better than, you know, because you go in with a lot of hope and sometimes it's disappointing, right? Although like I think as much as I say that, I have an inbuilt hierarchy of like, oh, another, if there's another person, because then it also means that, you know, someone is witnessing you, like they're like giving your time and you feel like special, you know, and
Hmm.
I want to feel special.
Yeah, I think, again, if you had asked me this question maybe 20 years ago or 15 years ago, I think some of those, we maybe more of that would feel resonant with where I am now. But as you were talking, I was just thinking about, I think this idea of like receiving pleasure as well. And because I think someone I'm both in my life and then in other ways around, um, yeah, I guess just around pleasure and other relationships, like often tend to be someone who tries to like give and like puts myself on the back burner.
Mm,
And so I think there's almost this aspect of like needing or wanting to kind of receive or kind of have a more reciprocated relationship that like when I'm by myself, it's just me. And so I think there's almost like there's not pressure, but I think it is this kind of like, well, is this how I want to enjoy pleasure with myself? Like, is this like would I,
mm,
okay, I don't have anyone around that I can experience sexual pleasure with. Fine. But would I rather go out and experience some other kind of joy and pleasure with people
mm,
or have time by myself with sexual pleasure. And again, not everything is an either or, but I
Yeah.
think just in terms of, for me, this kind of like, yeah, I think there's maybe this idea of like doing, not doing anything, but doing most things with other people is more enjoyable than doing a lot of things by myself, which is not something I would have thought, I don't think that's a sentence I would have thought I would say 20 years ago about
Mm,
myself. But it's certainly something I've been recognizing and realizing more is about just the kind of energy and life I feel when with and engaging with experiences with other people. Yeah, and I mean, also it could be just like, yeah, I should be spending more time trying to find sexual pleasure with myself, and then who knows what I could open up, right? So there's also
yeah.
that question, like maybe, yeah, maybe I just haven't done enough of that too, right? I'm open to those kind of ideas, but I think this idea of like, yeah, maybe for me, like I've done a lot around trying to please
Mm,
others, both sensually, sexually, and in a day-to-day life,
mm.
that there is a sense of just like, what does it mean to, yeah, I guess kind of release or be in communion with someone else in a way
I
that
was just
doesn't
thinking
feel
being in communion with your vibrator or like
sure, but
because
yeah.
like I think for the being like having like being assigned female at birth and then like currently I think of like okay when I look back and oh why was I with this person or like why did I go along with some things and then there's like this element of like feeling like oh I won't get that kind of nurturance or that kind of like being with someone if I don't keep trying. So then even if it was a not a good match, like you want to sort of, be with around that person, like especially in college. Um, like because you're still like, exploring those things. And I think as like your desires change, like the way you look at yourself, like the way you look identify, right? Like as that sort of changes throughout, um I think like self pleasure um became like one of those things where it's like oh some things that people can't give you like you can give yourself, and so it's become like a big part for me, almost like a hack into like oh like nothing is working out, right? Everything is feeling like disappointing, but then here like there's like so much written about this, like there's things you can do. You can sort of have a ritual of like taking care of yourself in that way, um so then it doesn't feel like powerless because there's a way in which you get objectified so much, um in the way your skin color is, in the way like what your surroundings are, like who are people around you. So as much as you want to like embody or feel empowered, someone else's idea kind of like takes shape, right? And then that kind of reflecting back, it might not feel like a good influence, right? Because sometimes, yeah, you want to be nurtured, you want to feel special, you want to be objectified in a certain like way that is, consensual for you. But I think just wanting to move away from that and be like, okay, people are not like there's nothing working out in this framework. So am I just doing this because it has to be done because chronologically your life is like has to be this way, like you have to get married, you have to do these things by a certain point. And then I think as a sort of antidote to that kind of thinking, the self pleasure aspect became a big piece for me. So then what it did was like you understand your body better. So then that information you can bring in when you are with another person to be like, hey, this feels good for me. And then it's like it feels more, you feel more special because the other person is like willing to spend time doing that for you. So for me, like the journey has been in that way, like really good and nurturing, especially when I felt very disempowered or felt like, oh, there's just nothing around.
I mean, I think, yeah, there's a lot of which are, all of us are different. I think,
Really? No.
So I think it's interesting because there have been times, and I think again, it's like how much do you feel assured and self assured in different experiences? Yeah, I think plenty of times when I haven't been experiencing, been like kind of practically celibate, I guess. And like usually that's fine. Like I feel like good and fine. Um Overall, it doesn't mean there's not a desire, a sensual desires I have, but I don't think because I don't think they are maybe achievable is the right word, like by myself, then it does feel so there's like a couple thought like there's something about that coming up for me. Something about this like is there some like underlying shame about different pieces or just like different things like pornography or erotica or these other things like
Mm,
how much do they influence me? Do I want to engage with them? Do I not? So like I think there's still some like me kind of pushing back against internalized thoughts about them, but also I guess
mm,
questioning those thoughts and maybe I do agree with them.
yeah.
So I think there's some of that. And then the other piece, yeah, just like how I spend my time. Like if I'm by myself and I want to kind of like be intentional about how I use my time, I think I probably would rather read a book than touch myself. Because like I can't
What
read a
about both?
sure. Yeah, I guess that's possible too. Maybe you gotta get more creative here. Both and mentality, exactly. Yeah, read some Greek
Erotica.
philosophy,
Greek philosophy.
whatever, Dante's Inferno, while I touch
No.
myself. No, but yeah, I think that is because yeah, I mean, certainly I can sit in the same room and with someone and we can read, but it's still a more of a solitary act. And I think for
Mm,
me, something about my sensuality is very
yeah.
much tied up in a relational thing.
Mm,
And again, and I think that's why I started like, yeah, we're all different. That may,
yeah.
that's not true maybe of you or of everybody, but I do think for me, like, there's something about, and certainly I can and probably should be questioning, like, oh, is this tied up in some like puritanical views around sex and sexuality? Maybe, but that's certainly where I am, and I might, I'm not swearing anything off or anything, but it's also just I think like when it comes down to it,
Mm,
yeah, I can, and again, not saying that I don't seek out or engage in instances of self pleasure, but I think for me, it ebbs and flows and kind of
mm.
doesn't. It's not.
But I know that you write erotic stories,
I
right?
have
Like,
before. I haven't written any recently, but yeah,
well,
I,
but
I
then
have.
what is inspiring that? Like, it's like some scenarios with people or like something to think
Yeah.
back to. So that to me would seem like, I guess also maybe the way that I'm talking about it in my head like has to be orgasmic or like it doesn't,
Hmm.
right? Like you can just feel pleasure and that's it. Like it doesn't have to sort of have that climax or anything like
Mm-hmm.
that. But certainly writing is something that you enjoy and then like
Yeah, I think. I mean, certainly. Yeah, I think there was like intellectual, sensual kind of combination that was going, that was and is in terms of like
mm,
writing and or reading those things. Because again, they were all, I guess, again, they were simulating scenarios between
mm,
people when I was by myself. So it's still this kind of like, I guess it makes sense that I'm like that's an aspect.
mm,
And maybe again, that's being able to think about what does it mean to incorporate these ideas when you are alone. And again, maybe
mm.
that's further exploration that I would need to, or that I would benefit from engaging with. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's just always incredible how these things like keep evolving.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think like often the nature of these conversations where I do feel like okay, I'll start with some assumptions about pleasure, right? And then there are already these conditionings we have, and I think most of the time, I think always it's such a widening of that like not like a sort of like a tunnel vision or like just like pointing at like oh this thing is the thing that is pleasurable and has to be done to like always but more so like it just sort of widens and so many different things. come in, which some of the things we don't even maybe think
Yeah,
about
I
actively.
can, I can only get satisfaction from mint chocolate chip ice cream. Like that's it. I was like, oh, but if you're never trying or exploring other things, you can't experience that. Oh, there's a lot out here, and all of these are
Mm,
provide me some, a source of pleasure,
mm. I
and
think the
it's
pleasure for
continued to
me
involve.
in that conversation is also like, okay, you start with like mint chocolate, whatever
Hmm.
ice cream, but then then the process of discovery that that's not the only thing
Hmm.
is like sort of what my interests are always like
Mm.
either for myself or hearing people's stories,
Mm.
like the process. I think like that's the kink I have where it doesn't involve like anything else but just the storytelling of like, oh, how did some where was someone and then how did they sort of discover that for themselves, which I think like that process in therapy can be very, very visible because it's sometimes it can take like over 6 months, over a few months to sort of have like that map or a picture in front of you that, oh, this person is putting value to this sort of, coming into feeling sensual or like
Hmm.
feeling pleasure. And then these are the reasons, or these are the many reasons, like right now that are visible. And there could be more, that there is no like concluding that this is just that. I think that is always exciting for me, which sometimes I feel like, okay, if I get too curious about it, like this, like, will there be judgment? You know? Because we are around so many other like scary stereotypes where why is someone like curious about these things. And I think in therapy it's, I think both as a being the therapist and in being in therapy, um like being in therapy and voicing some of the things and then having it received as like, oh, that doesn't, why does that feel like an important thing that might make you happy or sad, right? um and so really trying my best to uh, be open and have open-ended questions, so that the other person does get a lot of space but also doesn't feel like they have to sort of open up to the degree that I might be comfortable. And so that languaging piece is like so key to feel comfortable, because if someone just like pointedly asks, right, when it's like very overtly like a sexual question, because there's just no foundation, then it can feel like what, like it can feel unsafe
Hmm.
to engage in that. But to just to like, how do you approach these questions? Like, is there something as a therapist like?
I mean, I mean, the first thing for, as an individual and as a therapist, right, is to like get rid of the self-policing. I think that has to kind of be the foundation for any exploration of pleasure, joy, satisfaction, all those things, because I
Mm,
think that's so often we think about something has to be this way or this is the right way or this is how it has to be done. And I think
mm,
that, again, going back to this idea of like what gets in the way, I think that has to be this kind of grounded or ground foundation. I think a lot of people think about as a therapist this kind of unconditional regard for the person you're working with. And so what does it mean to come to yourself, come to someone else with just kind of this like there's, no judgment, no expectation. And then I think for as you said, it kind of allows for this openness and growth and curiosity, exploration, all those things can happen if you create that space. And so I
mm,
think for me, yeah, I think that's in some ways that's like the basis of all of my work as a therapist is just to create a space of comfort that then allows for exploration. And in some ways it's easier to do that for other people than to do it for myself sometimes.
yeah, yeah.
But I think that's what again whether you're kind of exploring something sexually with yourself or trying to understand the basics of childhood challenges, like all of those things require a level of comfort and openness and willingness to
Mm,
go wherever the thread leads you.
mm,
Yeah, I think that's a big part of what I seek to create. Yeah, for myself in my professional relationships and my personal other kinds of relationship is just to like create that space of openness. And I think, yeah, I think in many ways right now, my biggest struggle is creating that space for myself.
I guess like two questions I want to ask. Like they're connected but not connected. But first one, let's go with like how for you, yeah, drinking alcohol, smoking, like all of that is not something that you think as part of your identity or part of having fun or feeling pleasure. And so I was saying like that is something I don't understand. So like how come?
No, I mean, because I think ultimately this goes back to this question of intentionality. Like, I think that, well, around like substance use, like there was, in the US, you can't drink until you're 21. And so,
Which you followed.
right, I was raised in a very like kind of by the book, follow the rules way.
Mm.
And I was like, okay, well, I'm not supposed to drink until I'm 21. Okay, I'll just do that. Then I don't have to think about it. Then I actually don't have to make my own decision.
Hmm.
I'll just follow the rules. So then when 21 came around, I'm like, oh shit, now I have to decide for myself if this is what I want to do or not. And so that, I would say for like 5 or so minutes or 5 or so years, there was a lot of experimentation and like, how does this fit into my life? Does it fit at all? And I think kind of since then, and also I think being around, like I've lived with someone now for 7 years who is basically sober.
Mm.
So I think that's also something where it's not necessarily a part of my identity, but I also recognize like, oh, I don't need this. I don't need this.
Mm.
It's not something I crave or desire hugely.
Yeah.
So that's okay. And
You just don't enjoy how it makes you like
and yeah.
yeah.
So I
I
think
mean
like
it
that
just
for
shows
me,
like like for me that being a surprise is like, well, that is the way that I was raised, I guess. That so then just like we were saying earlier, that for different people, different things will feel pleasurable and getting to it in different ways.
hmm
And something can feel like, what? Really? For some people, and then for others, it's like, well, yeah, of course, you hang out, and when you hang out with friends, like drinking will happen, right? That is just assumed versus.
right. And I think that for me, it's like my enjoyment doesn't have to come because we're all drinking or
Mm.
because we're not all drinking. Like, how am I feeling right now? Like, am I going to drive? How long
Oh
am I going to be
yeah,
here? But like all those things, like, okay, you know, I I know that whether I choose to or not, I'm probably like that's not going to be the make or break of my time
right.
and the pleasure of the time. And I think just that confidence is really helpful to know that like
Like you're not missing out. Like you know yourself
yeah,
to
I
know
can
that
I can
you.
have fun. This will
Yeah.
be fun. I don't need this to kind of get to some other level
Right.
or like, oh, if I don't drink or if other people are drinking and I don't drink, I'm not gonna be enjoying myself. No,
Mm.
like I'm confident that like, oh yeah, I don't need this. And again, I think part of that is like being around someone who is saying that anyway. It's good to have that modeling of other people,
Mm.
and then you can for yourself say, okay, cool. I don't need that. But I think some of that also comes from probably when I was in college, and a lot of other people were
Centering that kind of.
drinking, yeah, centering
Yeah.
that or drinking around me, and I was like, okay, well, this is like I had to become some level of comfort of
Yeah.
that difference as well. So.
Yeah, like because my history is so different, but I think one thing that has helped me in my journey of staying sober and feeling inspired, even if it feels like painful, sometimes, is that choosing to be around people, persons who, like for you, like choosing to be around you and being like, oh, I'm not someone who always looks for that, right? Because when you step into that threshold and like figure out like, oh, these substances aren't good for me. Realizing that versus like getting to a point where your body feels comfortable is like a whole journey. But it's definitely helped me be like, hey, that is not the only way. I have friends or I have people in my life. And that's not the center of it.
Mm-hmm.
So in my own sort of like meditation of finding joy in becoming sober, I was like, oh, look, you chose this like almost as a safety mechanism in my head, because it's like, okay, I'm like, there'll be something about being accountable in love that I will not go overboard, because it's not, I think for you that's the truth, like you don't need those things, but for a lot of people they might want some solace in when they have to be in a group or just to be around people. And so substances can feel helpful in taking away anxiety, feeling less panicky, or like not feeling like you're judged, so that is like,
And to be fair, like I think I have and still sometimes do use, alcohol more likely of any substance to kind of say, okay, well, I know this will help me feel a little,
right,
whatever, take the edge
yeah,
off.
yeah,
But I'm doing it in a very intentional way and kind of saying, okay, I'm just gonna, have one drink and that'll feel fine. And again, there's kind of sometimes this wonder of like, is this actually the alcohol or is it just me releasing myself to be more comfortable? Again,
right,
like this idea of giving myself
permission,
permission.
yeah, yeah,
And so like, okay, whether it's actually the alcohol making me more comfortable or I'm giving myself permission in that moment to be more extroverted or more talkative or curious or whatever, it's still there's still an intentional thing that's happening, and it just so happens that substances sometimes happen, but I
yeah,
think that has also maybe been a stepping stone to say like it's not actually that, it's the permission giving to myself
yeah,
that actually is what helps me get to be and do the thing I want to do.
mm.
And what if I do just give myself that permission, be intentional. Like that's
Without,
actually the thing. The
right,
substances maybe in the past helped or I thought they helped, but it's really this mindset which was what allowed me to get where I wanted to go.
yeah, yeah, that's very inspiring to hear. It is. And the other question was like I was saying, like being non-monogamous, providing these spaces to be in like emotional connection with people,
Hmm.
right? That's what we were talking about.
That was some of it. I don't know where you're going with the question, but
But when did you realize that?
I mean, I think there's just a way.
So like, okay, let me explain this. So basically, like with like the idea of monogamy, it can be like so strict and like solid lines that there's like you have to police your brain into like nothing else, you can't think of anyone else, like you can't have emotional connect, and this is like the extremeness
Sure.
of it, right? And then depending on where we are, what is going on, we will sort of restrain ourselves. But I was saying like wanting to be open or non-monogamous, it's often because you would get policed around like who you can talk to, how you can talk to, right, someone, especially if you've like dated that person and not dating them anymore, like what is the relationship then, sort of like X being like the way that usually it's talked about, but then I would say like that's very limiting way of thinking of the person
Hmm.
in your life. So to continue having that emotional connect you don't even have to depend on that person, but just having that connect that you can sort of talk to them, that felt more possible for me.
That felt more possible to you.
Yeah, like that's what I wanted to.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's kind of this like question of, for me at least, like what makes sense, or like why does that policing happen, and like
Hmm.
how, like what is its purpose? I think that's often for me like, what is the purpose of these things? And so like the why of it, like why is it necessary, why is that the way things are? And if it feels like there's not a purpose for it or not a benefit to it, then I think it starts to, or it stops making sense, because I think it's just like, and again, I think that can be true like of something like monogamy. The frameworks like, oh, they have a purpose, they have a reason for some people in some situations, and maybe it makes sense to
Mm.
them. And maybe it, might even um
So there was like that, like making sense of it. Like what? Practical monogamy? What was that?
no, yeah, I mean I think this, yeah, the like sexual monogamy or practical or emotional, like all these different realms, like what makes sense, and maybe it's not even with, like you said, there may be some circumstances though it's like, oh, for particular reasons, this actually does make sense to limit
Mm.
some type of contact or some type of relationship or a level of a kind of relationship, and needing to create that boundary. But maybe, maybe not. But just, I guess, like that willingness to ask the kind of the why question, like why is this the setup, the expectation,
Mm.
like what purpose does this serve?
Yeah.
And if you don't have a very good answer, then maybe you need to be questioning the setup in the first place.
Mm. Like, but what kind of setup though?
Of monogamy, of living together, of talking a certain frequency, of having a job, like anything. I think you could, I think we should be asking ourselves this question all the time. Like, are the things I'm doing, I mean, even going back to this question about like using substances, like what
Yeah.
is the purpose? Like, is this serving a purpose that is conscious, is intentional, that I value, that has some kind of benefit or some other quality,
Mm.
and I think you have to be able to continue to answer that question of like, oh yeah, this does serve a purpose. It meets a need.
Mm.
Often, probably that's a big part of it, but like, or it meets a need, or it helps me fulfill a goal, or it's a curiosity that I have. What is this actually? Is it serving a purpose, or is this something that maybe I need to be more questioning of as to the why it's existing in a certain way, and
Mm.
perhaps shifting that if it makes
Mm.
more sense to do something in a different way.
And like for you, like, but how did you, or how are you? Because the question of purpose, like there are a lot of stories around us where the purpose might not be our own, but we're forced to fulfill,
Mhm.
right? So then how did you discern like, oh, okay, this purpose feels like something worthwhile, knowing myself? Because that's a big word, right? Like there's
Sure.
very
I mean, I think it's an ongoing question. I don't think we can ever, kind of come down on the side of yes or no, or like it
mm,
does or it doesn't. Um, and I think even to your point of like, then you start to think about like is purpose of individual or the family, the community,
mm,
the world, and all of those might have competing, the community might have a competing need to the individual. And yeah, I think that's a good point, right? It's not all, I can't always just ask this question under the lens of like what
mm,
is best for me,
mm,
if you want to have a more
yeah,
expansive understanding of, because it might, or, a partner, like, oh, for me, it doesn't matter if I'm meeting up with, having sex with, building some kind of intense relationship with other people, but it does impact this, relationship I have with the other parent of my children,
mm,
and that has consequences in
right,
ways that I want to be cognizant of.
mm,
And so even if for me there's, it does or doesn't kind of meet some purpose or
mm,
anything, but like for my children, for my partner, for my community, for my larger family, it actually benefits all of those to act and be in a certain way. I think that's another, that's a very expansive way of looking
yeah,
at that question. And I think it's also a very valid one. Some people may come to different conclusions around the same
yeah,
piece, but I think it's a very valid to say, and you have to give people space to say that. And again, you have to have, I think, that safe environment
Yeah.
around like letting someone say like, yeah, this is hard for me to do, or if it was just up to me, I wouldn't do it. But when it comes to
Hi.
well, when it comes to these other priorities I have, this is where I land.
Mm. Yeah, I often like think and talk about you're born and there's like this rush to sort of like figure life out, you know.
Hmm.
You have to decide what you're gonna be, like all of that, like it's such a rush. And for whatever reason, like by choice or not by choice, like we might get cues to like slow down and then have community or like be in an environment where one can even have this discussion, let alone like act, right?
Hmm.
Is so key because a lot of the times like there's no space. There's just and so like there's a lot of doubt, which can feel very scary. Like
Hmm.
having doubt or being in pain, like with people who feel like, yeah, you feel pain about not leading a certain kind of life or hoping because there's some values that are important for you that you see in them, right? And so it's not so much about someone taking away that pain, but just like saying, like, yeah, that warrants like time and space, and you are, of course, you should be doing it, right?
Hmm.
That is like so rare from like the context that I come from.
Hmm.
And so for me, it has happened more so recently by choice, but in the beginning, it was just kind of like kicking and screaming, because you just want like things to be simplified, right? You don't want to have your brain have to overwork all the time
Yeah.
or your body to, yeah, be in that state of like fluctuation or not feeling like grounded. But like now you do more of the group work or like you are part of a group. Like, is that a space for you where that has been possible?
Yeah, I think I mean, yeah, I lead a group. I've been parts of groups in different kind of ways, the groups function in different ways, but yeah, I think being in a group in many ways because it helps you kind of locate yourself, I guess also
Mm,
both in perhaps contrast or opposition to the other
mm,
people or in a similarity or shared way. It can be helpful to kind of release maybe what you're talking about, that kind of like pressure or the intensity. It
mm,
kind of diffuses that because it doesn't feel like you're the only one engaged in that.
yeah,
That stress, that anxiety, that pressure can feel much more diffuse amongst other people.
yeah,
And so I think yeah, I think group spaces, group spaces, or again, just in conversing with other people, you kind of can get to this place of, oh, okay, um, this is where I'm at. These are other people, and again, you're doing that in a group, so you're
mm,
seeing the world beyond yourself, which I think is a very valuable experience.
yeah. Sort of that having like a wider vision than like a panicky, like,
Hmm.
oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, makes sense. Is there anything else you want to share or any question you wish like, oh, I could have been asked this and I
No,
wasn't asked this?
no, I came in with no expectations and no planned desires. So
How was the conversation been like?
good. I mean, I think it's yeah, I think there's this question, this kind of like, and maybe this is again going back to how we all engage in the world, like how, yeah, can I just allow this to be my piece, or am I trying to speak for more than myself? How can I just be confident that this is just me sharing my
Mm,
experience? And I think, everybody has to have kind of again, giving yourself permission to just say, okay, this is just me. Hopefully everyone can know and hear
mm,
that it's just me,
yeah.
and leave it at that.
Wonderful. It's
Thank
been a
you.
pleasure.
Same, it's been a joy.